The first thing I noticed was the backpack hanging from the tree. It wasn't unusual for hikers to leave small markers along a trail, but this one looked different. The fabric was faded, the straps twisted around a low branch as if someone had tied it there deliberately. Beneath it, scattered across the dirt, were several objects that didn't seem to belong in the forest at all. A pair of muddy hiking boots, a broken phone, and something dark staining the ground that looked far too old to still be wet. I remember standing there in the dim light, staring at the strange collection of things and wondering why anyone would abandon their gear like that. It wasn't until later that I understood the backpack hadn't been left behind by accident. Someone had placed it there, but by the time I realized what it meant, I had already wandered far deeper into the woods than I ever intended to go. The strange part was that I hadn't even planned on hiking that day. Earlier that afternoon, the trail had seemed completely ordinary. It was a quiet state park about 2 hours from where I lived, a place that local hikers recommended whenever someone wanted a peaceful walk away from the city. The kind of forest where the paths are wide and clearly marked, where families bring their kids and dogs wander ahead of their owners without anyone worrying too much about getting lost. At least that's how it appeared when I first arrived. But sometime between the late afternoon sun slipping behind the hills and the first shadows stretching across the trail, something about the place began to feel different. The path I had been following slowly narrowed until it looked less like a maintained trail and more like a stretch of forest that people simply walked through occasionally. The trees grew thicker. The sounds of other hikers faded away, and the light filtering through the branches above me grew dim enough that I had to check the time just to make sure night wasn't approaching faster than I expected. That was when I realized something else. I hadn't seen another person for almost an hour. At first I assumed the trail simply looped back toward the parking area somewhere ahead, but when I checked the map on my phone, the signal had already disappeared. No service, no location marker, just the small blue dot frozen in the middle of a blank screen. It was around that time that the forest began to feel unfamiliar, and a few minutes later, I found the backpack hanging from the tree. For a few seconds, I simply stood there staring at the backpack, trying to convince myself that what I had found wasn't as strange as it looked. Hikers lose things all the time. A torn strap, a broken zipper. Maybe someone had simply decided the bag wasn't worth carrying any farther. But the longer I looked at the ground beneath the tree, the less believable that explanation felt. The boots were placed side by side, almost neatly, as if someone had taken them off carefully instead of abandoning them in a hurry. The phone nearby had a cracked screen but looked otherwise intact. Even the backpack itself appeared mostly undamaged. None of it looked like the result of an accident. What bothered me more was how quiet the forest had become. When I first started walking earlier that afternoon, there had been birds calling from the trees and the distant sounds of other hikers somewhere along the main trail. Now the only thing I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves moving slowly in the breeze. I crouched down and picked up the phone. The battery was long dead, but the back of the case caught my attention. A small sticker had been placed just beneath the camera. It was a national park pass, the kind hikers sometimes put on their gear when they travel between different trails. Except this one had something else written on it. A name. Underneath it was a date from almost a year earlier. I remember turning the phone over in my hand, staring at that name for a moment as a vague memory surfaced in the back of my mind. I couldn't place where I'd heard it before, but something about it felt familiar. Eventually, I set the phone back down beside the boots and stood up again, suddenly aware of how quickly the light was fading through the trees. The forest around me had taken on that dim gray color that happens just before evening settles in completely. That was when I noticed something else. There were more objects further ahead along the narrow path. At first, I thought they might be rocks or fallen branches, but as I stepped closer, I realized they were pieces of hiking gear scattered across the ground. A torn water bottle, a rusted flashlight, and several yards beyond that, another backpack hanging from another tree. Except this one looked much older. The fabric had faded almost white in places, and one of the straps dangled loosely as if it had been cut rather than torn. Standing there, between the two trees, a strange realization began to settle in. The gear didn't belong to the same person. The items were too different, too worn in different ways, which meant the backpack I'd found earlier probably hadn't been the only one left behind out here. And as I slowly turned to look deeper into the darkening woods, I could see more branches in the distance. Some of them had shapes hanging from them. Shapes that looked uncomfortably similar to the first bag I'd discovered. For a moment, I considered turning around. The forest had grown dim enough that the narrow path ahead looked more like a tunnel between the trees than an actual trail, and the scattered gear hanging from the branches created an uneasy feeling that was difficult to ignore. Even if there was a reasonable explanation for it, I wasn't particularly interested in finding out what that explanation might be after dark. Still, curiosity kept pulling my attention forward. I walked slowly toward the second backpack, stepping carefully around the scattered objects on the ground. Up close, the bag looked even older than I'd thought. The zipper had rusted slightly and one of the outer pockets hung open, spilling a few small items into the dirt below. Inside that pocket, I found a folded piece of paper. It looked like a printed trail map. The edges were worn and damp from months of exposure to the weather, but the markings on the surface were still visible. Someone had circled several points along the hiking routes with a dark pen. At first, I assumed they were simply marking places they planned to visit. But then I noticed something strange. Every circle was drawn far away from the official paths. They were scattered through areas of forest where the map didn't show any trails at all. While I was studying the map, something else caught my eye on the trunk of the tree where the bag was hanging. At first, it looked like a set of random scratches in the bark, but when I leaned closer, the shapes started to form a pattern. Lines intersecting with curved marks. Symbols carved carefully enough that they couldn't have been made accidentally. There were several of them running vertically along the trunk. Some looked newer than others, as if people had returned to the same tree over and over again, carving similar markings each time. A quiet uneasiness crept into the back of my mind then, because the longer I stared at those shapes, the more certain I became that they weren't ordinary trail markers. They were too deliberate, too organized. And when I stepped back and glanced around the surrounding trees, I noticed something that made the situation feel much worse. Several of the other trunks nearby had the same carvings on them. Not identical symbols, but variations of the same strange pattern. Almost like a system of signs guiding someone through the woods, or leading them somewhere. By then, the light had faded enough that the forest had taken on a dull, bluish tone. The shadows between the trees stretched longer across the ground, and the narrow path I'd been following seemed to disappear deeper into the darkness ahead. I checked my phone again out of habit. Still no signal. and as I slipped it back into my pocket, another sound drifted faintly through the trees. At first, it was so quiet that I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it, but a few seconds later, it came again. A distant noise, low and rhythmic, almost like several voices speaking somewhere far off in the forest. The sound was faint, but once I noticed it, it became impossible to ignore. It carried through the forest in slow, uneven waves, rising and falling, just enough that it almost blended with the movement of the wind through the trees. At first, I assumed it might be other hikers somewhere in the distance, maybe a group talking as they walked along a different trail. But the longer I listened, the less it sounded like casual conversation. The voices were too synchronized, too slow. Each murmur seemed to follow the same rhythm, as if several people were repeating the same words over and over again. Without really meaning to, I began walking in the direction of the sound. The narrow path that had guided me earlier slowly disappeared beneath fallen leaves and tangled roots, forcing me to push carefully through thicker patches of trees. The forest floor sloped gently downward as I moved, and the fading light made it harder to see where I was placing my feet. Every so often I passed another strange object hanging from a branch, a torn jacket, an empty water bottle, a small camera case with the zipper half open. By that point, I had stopped convincing myself these items belonged to a single lost hiker. There were too many of them, scattered too widely across the woods to belong to just one person. The disturbing thought forming in the back of my mind was that each item might belong to someone different, someone who had never made it back out of these trees. The voices grew slightly louder as I moved forward, and then, quite suddenly, the forest opened. The trees parted into a wide clearing that must have been at least 30 yards across, though the darkness made it difficult to judge the exact distance. The ground there looked different from the surrounding forest, as if it had been disturbed many times over the years. Several large stones formed a rough circle near the center, but what immediately caught my attention wasn't the stones. It was everything around them. Dozens of objects were scattered across the clearing. Backpacks, hiking poles, flashlights, pieces of clothing. Some of them looked relatively new, while others had clearly been sitting there for years. The entire area looked less like a campsite and more like a collection of things that had been deliberately gathered in one place. Almost like trophies. My eyes moved slowly across the clearing until they reached the center of the stone circle. At first I thought it was just another rock, but after a few seconds I realized it wasn't. It was a wooden structure. Several thick branches had been tied together to form a tall frame that rose nearly 7 feet from the ground. Dark stains covered parts of the wood, and pieces of rope hung loosely from the crossbars. Even in the fading light, it was obvious what the structure had been used for. And the moment that realization settled in, the voices I had been hearing suddenly stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced since entering the forest. For several seconds I stood perfectly still, staring at the empty clearing. Then, somewhere behind the trees on the far side of the stones, a branch snapped, and I slowly began to understand that the voices I'd followed into the forest hadn't disappeared at all. They had simply gone quiet, because whoever had been making them had just realized someone else was there. The sound of the branch snapping was quiet, but in the sudden silence of the clearing, it felt impossibly loud. Every instinct I had told me not to move. I stood just inside the edge of the trees, barely breathing, staring toward the opposite side of the clearing where the noise had come from. The darkness there was thicker, the shapes of the trunks blending together into a wall of shadow that made it difficult to see anything clearly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the shadows moved. It was subtle at first, just a faint shift between two trees. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't the wind moving the branches. Someone was standing there. The figure stepped slowly into the faint light spilling across the clearing. They were wearing dark clothing, long and heavy enough that it blended almost completely with the surrounding forest. Their head was covered by a hood or some kind of cloth, making it impossible to see their face clearly from where I stood. A few seconds later, another figure appeared beside them. Then another. Within moments, I could make out at least 5 people standing just beyond the circle of stones. None of them were speaking. They simply stood there, looking toward the clearing, looking toward me. A slow, uncomfortable realization settled in my chest. They hadn't just discovered me. They had known I was there long before I reached the clearing. The scattered gear along the path, the backpacks hanging from the trees, the symbols carved into the bark. All of it suddenly felt less like random discoveries and more like something designed to guide people deeper into the forest, to lead them here. The wooden structure at the center of the stones suddenly seemed far more deliberate than I had originally thought. And judging by the number of abandoned belongings around the clearing, I probably wasn't the first person to follow that path. One of the figures took a slow step forward. Even in the dim light, I could see something strange hanging from their neck. At first, it looked like a necklace made of small wooden pieces. But as the person moved closer, I realized they weren't wooden. They were bone. Thin fragments strung together with dark thread, forming a crude symbol that looked disturbingly similar to the carvings I'd seen on the trees. Another figure shifted slightly behind them. Then another. No one spoke. No one made any sudden movements. They simply stood there, watching. And after a few seconds, I understood something else that made the situation even worse. There were more of them than I could see. Shapes moved slowly between the trees behind the first group, just barely visible in the darkness. Waiting. Observing. The forest that had seemed empty only minutes earlier suddenly felt full of people. People who had been performing some kind of ritual in that clearing, and who were now staring directly at the person who had accidentally walked into it. For a moment, none of us moved. Then the first figure raised their hand slightly, and the others began walking toward me. The moment they started moving, whatever shock had been holding me in place finally broke. I turned and ran. Branches scraped against my arms as I pushed back into the trees, moving in the general direction I thought I'd come from. The fading light made it difficult to see the ground clearly, and several times I nearly lost my footing on exposed roots or loose rocks hidden beneath the leaves. Behind me, I could hear movement. Not shouting, not the chaotic noise you might expect from people suddenly chasing someone through the forest. Instead, there were only controlled, deliberate footsteps spreading through the trees. They weren't running. That realization made the situation feel far worse. It meant they weren't worried about losing me. The forest had grown darker in the short time I spent at the clearing, and the narrow spaces between the trees created long corridors of shadow that made it almost impossible to tell which direction I was moving. Several times I passed trunks with the same strange carvings, etched into the bark, the symbols appearing briefly in the dim light before disappearing behind me again. At one point, I nearly tripped over something lying in the path. I stumbled forward and caught myself on a nearby branch, turning just long enough to see what I'd stepped over. It was another backpack, but this one looked different from the others. The fabric was still clean, the straps hardly worn at all. Someone must have lost it recently, or more likely, someone had been carrying it not very long ago. That thought sent a cold wave of dread through me, and I forced myself to keep moving. The forest around me felt endless now, every direction filled with the same dense walls of trees and low branches that scraped at my shoulders as I ran. A faint sound echoed somewhere to my left, then another further behind me. It took a few seconds before I realized what it was. Whistles. Low, short bursts of sound moving through the woods in different directions. They were communicating with each other, coordinating, which meant they weren't just chasing me blindly through the forest. They were spreading out, trying to cut me off. I slowed slightly, forcing myself to listen over the pounding of my own breathing. If they were positioning themselves around me, running in a straight line would only make it easier for them to predict where I was going. Somewhere ahead, the ground sloped upward again, forming a narrow ridge between two clusters of trees. I veered toward it, hoping the higher ground might help me spot the trail I had originally followed earlier that afternoon. But as I climbed the slope, something else became visible through the dim light filtering between the branches. More carvings, not just on one tree, on nearly every trunk surrounding the ridge. Dozens of symbols carved into the bark, layered over each other as if generations of people had returned to this exact place over and over again. The deeper I moved into the forest, the clearer the realization became. This wasn't just a random group of people performing strange rituals in the woods. The entire area had been prepared for it, marked, maintained, and used for a very long time. Then another whistle sounded, much closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving quickly through the trees somewhere just ahead of me. I stopped immediately. The footsteps ahead of me were moving fast now, pushing through branches in a way that made it clear whoever was there was no longer trying to stay quiet. For a moment, I stood frozen halfway up the ridge, my chest rising and falling so hard that I was certain the sound of my breathing would give me away. Another whistle echoed somewhere behind me. Then a second one answered from my right. They were closing in. The realization forced me to move again, but this time I turned sharply off the ridge and pushed downhill into a thicker section of forest where the undergrowth was dense enough to hide me from view. Branches snapped under my feet as I moved, and the ground grew uneven enough that I had to slow slightly just to avoid falling. After about 20 seconds of running, I dropped behind a fallen tree and crouched low against the damp leaves. The forest around me returned to silence, at least for a moment. Then I heard the footsteps again. Two people moved along the ridge I had just left, their shapes barely visible between the trunks above me. They carried flashlights, but instead of sweeping them wildly through the trees, the beams moved slowly and carefully across the ground. They were looking for tracks. One of them stopped near the edge of the ridge, shining their light down the slope where I had descended. I pressed myself deeper, into the shadows behind the fallen trunk, barely daring to breathe as the beam drifted across the ground, only a few yards away. For several seconds, the light remained there, illuminating broken twigs and disturbed leaves that probably made my escape path painfully obvious. But strangely, the two figures didn't follow it immediately. Instead, they stood there whispering quietly to each other. Their voices were too low for me to understand the words, though the tone carried an odd sense of patience that made the situation feel even more unsettling. Eventually, one of them raised a hand and pointed deeper into the forest. The other nodded. Then both figures turned and began moving away along the ridge. I waited several seconds before shifting slightly behind the fallen tree, trying to understand what had just happened. If they had clearly seen the direction I ran, there was no reason for them not to follow. Unless they already knew where I was going. The thought sent a chill down my spine, because when I lifted my head slightly and looked around the forest floor where I was hiding, I noticed something I hadn't seen while running. Several thin ropes were stretched low between the trees nearby. At first they looked like vines tangled through the undergrowth, but when I leaned closer I could see small bells tied along their length. Dozens of them. Quiet. Waiting. And positioned exactly along the path I'd been about to take deeper into the forest. For several seconds I stared at the thin ropes stretched between the trees, trying to process what I was looking at. The bells attached to them were small, the kind that barely make any sound unless something touches them directly. In the dim light, they looked almost invisible, blending perfectly with the surrounding branches and vines. If I'd kept running the way I was before, I would have walked straight into them. And judging by how many ropes I could see woven between the trunks nearby, that wasn't an accident. The forest around the clearing had been turned into a trap. Paths guided people deeper into the woods. Objects left behind to draw curiosity. And if someone tried to escape, the bells would announce exactly where they were. A faint whistle sounded again somewhere in the distance, then another slightly closer. They were still searching, slowly tightening whatever perimeter they had formed around the area. I carefully shifted backward from the ropes, making sure not to disturb them, and began moving in the opposite direction. Instead of running, I moved slowly now, stepping carefully over fallen branches and avoiding patches of dry leaves that might make noise under my feet. The forest was almost completely dark by that point. Only faint traces of twilight filtered through the canopy above, turning the world around me into shifting shapes and silhouettes. Every tree trunk looked the same. Every direction felt uncertain, and the sense of being watched refused to fade, no matter how quietly I moved. After several minutes of slow, cautious steps, I began to notice something else. The trees ahead looked slightly different. Thinner, more spaced apart. The ground sloped downward again, forming what appeared to be a shallow valley running between two ridges of forest. For the first time since leaving the clearing, a small sense of hope began to form in the back of my mind. If the terrain was changing, there was a chance I was moving away from wherever the cult had established their ritual area. The symbols carved into the bark had also become less frequent, which made the woods feel slightly less oppressive. But as I stepped further into the valley, my foot suddenly struck something hidden beneath the leaves. I stumbled forward and caught myself against a tree, looking down to see what I'd kicked. At first, I thought it was just another piece of abandoned gear. But when I brushed away the leaves covering it, the shape beneath them became clear. It wasn't a backpack or a flashlight. It was a small pile of bones. Human bones. Several of them were partially buried in the dirt, while others lay scattered nearby as if animals had dragged them apart over time. A torn piece of clothing clung to one of the remains, the fabric faded and stiff with age. For a moment I couldn't move. The forest around me felt impossibly silent again, as if the entire place had been holding its breath. And then, somewhere behind me in the darkness, one of the bells rang. Soft, clear, and much closer than before. The sound of the bell froze me where I stood. It was faint, barely more than a soft metallic chime drifting through the trees, but in the silence of the valley it felt impossibly loud. For a moment I stared down at the bones scattered across the forest floor, my mind struggling to process what I just found. Someone had died here. Not recently. Judging by the way the remains had begun to sink into the soil, but not so long ago that the clothing had completely disintegrated either. And judging by the number of bones lying around the area, it probably hadn't been just one person. Another bell chimed somewhere further up the slope behind me. Then a whistle followed. Short, sharp. Whoever had triggered the rope trap was close enough now that I could hear branches snapping under their feet as they moved through the forest. For a few seconds I simply stood there, listening to the sounds approaching through the darkness. Then instinct took over again. I moved quickly down the valley, keeping low and weaving between the thinner trees as quietly as I could. The ground here was softer, damp enough that my footsteps made less noise, but the uneven terrain forced me to move carefully to avoid tripping. Behind me, the whistles continued, each one answered by another somewhere deeper in the woods. They were closing in again, except this time their movement sounded different, more urgent. Whoever had triggered the bell must have confirmed exactly where I was. I pushed harder through the valley, my breathing growing heavier as the forest floor sloped gradually downward. The darkness had deepened enough that I could barely see more than a few yards ahead, forcing me to rely mostly on the shapes of the trees and the faint outlines of the terrain to guide me forward. Then suddenly the ground beneath my feet changed. Instead of leaves and soft dirt, my boots struck something harder, packed gravel. I slowed immediately and crouched low, brushing away a thin layer of leaves to see what I'd stepped onto. A narrow path ran across the valley floor. Not a natural clearing, an actual trail. It was faint and partially overgrown, but the straight edges and compacted surface made it obvious that people had walked there many times before. For the first time since the chase began, a surge of hope pushed through the panic building in my chest. If there was a trail here, it might lead back toward the main hiking routes, or even the parking area where I'd started earlier that afternoon. But before I could start following it, something else caught my attention. Footprints. Several sets of them pressed into the damp gravel. Some looked old, but others were fresh, very fresh, and they weren't heading away from me. They were coming toward the valley, toward the place where I was standing. For a moment I just stared at the footprints. Even in the dim light, it was obvious that several people had walked along that narrow trail recently. The impressions were deep and clear in the damp gravel, some overlapping others as if a group had passed through the valley together not long ago. The direction they were moving made my stomach drop. They were heading straight toward the clearing I had escaped from, which meant this path wasn't a way out of the forest. It was part of their route. A cold realization slowly settled in as I looked up and down the trail stretching through the valley. This wasn't just some hidden ritual site used occasionally by a small group of people. The paths, the traps, the carvings on the trees, all of it suggested something much larger, something organized, and something that had probably been happening here for years. Another whistle echoed through the forest behind me. Closer now. Branches cracked somewhere up the slope, followed by the faint glow of a flashlight beam weaving between the trees. They were moving fast again, Without wasting another second, I turned and began following the trail in the opposite direction of the footprints. Even if it had been used by the cult, a maintained path still offered a better chance of navigating through the darkness than blindly pushing through the forest. The gravel crunched softly under my boots as I moved. I tried to stay near the edges of the trail where the leaves muffled the sound, but the uneven ground forced me to step onto the path more often than I liked. Behind me, the flashlight beam appeared briefly between two trees at the top of the slope. It swept slowly across the valley floor, then stopped. For a second, everything went quiet. Then the whistle came again, louder, followed by several more answering calls from different directions. The forest suddenly filled with movement. Flashlights flickered through the trees as figures began descending into the valley from both sides of the ridge. Whoever had spotted me must have realized I was following the trail, because two of the beams swung immediately toward the direction I was heading. They weren't trying to hide anymore. I broke into a run again, pushing harder down the narrow path as the gravel shifted beneath my feet. The trail curved gradually through the valley, disappearing around a cluster of large rocks about 50 yards ahead. As I reached the bend, something else came into view beyond the stones. A faint, orange glow flickering through the trees. At first I thought it might be firelight from another ritual site deeper in the forest, but as I moved closer, the shape of something else appeared beside the glow. A wooden structure, small, rectangular, and surrounded by a thin fence that looked almost like a boundary marker. It took me a second to understand what I was seeing. A ranger station, or at least the remains of one. The building looked old and partially abandoned, but a dim lantern burned beside the door, casting weak light across the clearing around it. For the first time all night, the forest ahead of me looked like it might actually lead back to civilization. But as I slowed near the edge of the clearing, another shape moved in the lantern light beside the cabin. Someone was already standing there, watching the trail, waiting. I stopped immediately when I saw the figure near the cabin. For a moment, my brain tried to convince me it might be a ranger, someone responsible for maintaining the trails who happened to be stationed there overnight. The small wooden building certainly looked like it had once served that purpose, and the lantern hanging beside the door gave the clearing a faint sense of normalcy that felt almost comforting after the darkness of the forest. But that feeling lasted only a few seconds. The person standing near the fence wasn't wearing a ranger's uniform. He was dressed in the same dark clothing I had seen in the clearing earlier, and hanging from his neck, barely visible in the lantern light, was the same necklace made from thin pieces of bone. The realization hit me instantly. The station wasn't a refuge, it was part of their territory. I stepped backward into the shadows at the edge of the trees, hoping the darkness would hide me long enough to think. The sounds of movement behind me were growing louder again as the others descended into the valley, their flashlights weaving through the branches as they followed the trail I had taken. I was trapped between them and the cabin. The figure by the fence suddenly turned slightly, his head tilting toward the forest as if he had heard something approaching. For a moment he stood perfectly still, listening. Then slowly, he began walking toward the trail. The lantern light followed him just enough for me to see his face as he stepped closer, or at least the thing covering it. A crude mask made from rough wood and bone fragments concealed most of his features, leaving only dark gaps where his eyes should have been. Strange symbols had been carved into the surface, the same shapes I had seen etched into the trees deeper in the forest. The person stopped in the middle of the path and looked directly toward the trees where I was hiding. Even from that distance, I had the terrible feeling he knew exactly where I was. Behind me, another flashlight beam cut through the forest, then another. The group chasing me had reached the valley floor. If the person near the cabin called out or signaled to them, they would have me surrounded within seconds. My eyes moved quickly across the clearing, searching for anything that might help. The fence around the ranger station looked old and partially collapsed in several places. Beyond it, the terrain sloped gently downward again, and through the trees on the far side, I could see something that looked faintly familiar. A wide strip of pale ground, gravel, a road. If I could reach the other side of the clearing without being seen, there was a chance I could make it there before the others caught up. But the masked figure still stood in the middle of the trail, watching the darkness, waiting for me to make the first move. For several seconds I remained perfectly still behind the trees, watching the figure standing on the trail. The lantern beside the ranger station flickered softly in the wind, throwing long, shifting shadows across the clearing. The masked person didn't move much, but the way he stood there made it obvious he wasn't simply guarding the cabin. He was waiting, listening. Behind me, the sounds of the others moving through the forest had grown louder. Branches snapped occasionally, and the faint glow of their flashlights drifted between the trunks as they descended from the ridge into the valley. If I stayed where I was much longer, they would reach the trail and see the same clearing I was looking at, which meant my window to escape was disappearing quickly. My eyes moved again toward the far side of the clearing, where the trees thinned near the gravel road. It couldn't have been more than 50 yards away, maybe less if I ran in a straight line. The problem was crossing the open ground without the masked figure noticing. But as I watched him, something strange happened. He turned slightly toward the forest behind the cabin. For just a second. It wasn't much of a movement, but it was enough. I moved immediately. Keeping low, I slipped between two trees and stepped carefully into the edge of the clearing. The grass there was damp and soft under my boots, which helped muffle the sound as I slowly moved forward. 10 yards, then 15. The lantern light barely reached that far, leaving most of the clearing dim enough that I could still blend into the shadows. The masked figure remained facing the trail, listening for the others approaching through the forest. Another 20 yards, and I would reach the broken section of fence. I took another careful step forward, then another. But just as I reached the center of the clearing, one of the flashlights behind me suddenly swept across the trees at the valley's edge. The beam cut through the darkness and briefly illuminated my silhouette against the open ground. For a split second, everything froze. Then the masked figure turned his head sharply toward me. The moment our eyes met through the holes in the wooden mask, he raised his arm and let out a sharp whistle that echoed across the clearing. The response came instantly. Several answering whistles erupted from the forest behind me, and suddenly every flashlight beam in the valley swung toward the same place, toward the center of the clearing, toward me. I didn't hesitate this time. I ran. The distance to the broken fence felt impossibly long as my boots tore across the damp grass. Behind me, I could hear multiple people crashing through the trees now, no longer concerned about staying quiet as they rushed toward the clearing. I vaulted over the collapsed section of fence and hit the ground on the other side hard enough to nearly lose my balance. But the gravel road was right there, and for the first time since the nightmare began, I could see open sky above the trees. I sprinted toward the road just as the first cult member burst from the forest behind me. And then something unexpected happened. A pair of headlights suddenly appeared around the bend in the road ahead. The headlights appeared so suddenly that for a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Two bright beams cut through the darkness of the road, bouncing slightly as the vehicle rounded the bend about 100 yards ahead. The sudden light flooded the edge of the forest and spilled across the gravel, illuminating the clearing behind me just enough that I could see several figures emerging from the trees. They stopped almost immediately when the lights reached them. For a second, none of us moved. I stood in the middle of the road, breathing hard, staring directly into the approaching headlights, while the people behind me froze at the edge of the forest like shadows that had been caught in a spotlight. The vehicle slowed. The engine rumbled as it rolled closer, gravel crunching under the tires. Then the driver slammed on the brakes. The door flew open. A man stepped out quickly, holding a flashlight in one hand as he looked toward me in obvious confusion. For a moment I couldn't speak. My lungs burned from running, and the adrenaline flooding my body made it difficult to form words. But eventually something came out. "Help," I managed, my voice shaking more than I expected. "There are people in the woods." The man turned his flashlight toward the forest behind me. The beam swept slowly across the trees, but the clearing was empty. The figures who had been standing there seconds earlier had already disappeared back into the darkness. Whoever they were, they knew better than to stay visible near the road. The man lowered the flashlight slightly, looking back at me with a mixture of concern and confusion. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I shook my head, still trying to catch my breath. "They were chasing me," I said. "There's something happening out there. A clearing, people. I think they've been taking hikers." The driver studied my face for a moment, as if trying to decide whether I was panicked or simply exhausted. Then he glanced once more toward the silent forest. "Get in the truck," he said finally. I didn't hesitate. I climbed into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut just as another faint whistle drifted through the trees behind us. It was distant this time, almost cautious, like a signal given from far deeper within the forest. The driver heard it too. His expression shifted slightly as he started the engine again. Without another word, he turned the truck around on the narrow road and began driving away from the trail. The headlights swept across the trees one last time as we pulled away. And for a brief moment, standing just beyond the reach of the light, I thought I saw a single figure watching us from the edge of the woods. Still, silent, waiting for the darkness to return. The drive back toward the highway felt strangely quiet. For the first few minutes, neither of us said much. The man kept both hands on the wheel while the truck's headlights cut through the winding road ahead, illuminating long stretches of empty pavement and thick forest pressing in from both sides. I kept glancing over my shoulder through the rear window. The darkness behind us remained still. No flashlights, no movement, just trees. Eventually, the driver broke the silence. "You said someone was chasing you?" I nodded slowly, trying to steady my breathing enough to explain what I'd seen. The words came out uneven at first, but once I started talking, everything spilled out quickly. The backpacks in the trees, the strange carvings on the bark, the clearing filled with abandoned gear, the wooden frame in the center of the stones, and the people wearing bone necklaces and masks. The man didn't interrupt while I spoke. His eyes remained on the road the entire time, though I noticed his grip tightening slightly around the steering wheel as the story continued. When I finished, the truck had already reached the main highway leading out of the park. That was when he finally spoke again. "You're not the first person who's come out of those woods saying something like that." The sentence made my stomach tighten. I turned toward him. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "People go missing around this area more often than they should. Hikers mostly. Every few years, someone disappears along one of the trails deeper in the park. Search teams come out. Helicopters fly over the forest for days, but most of the time they never find anything." He paused briefly as the truck passed beneath a dim street light. "Sometimes they do find things, though." "Like what?" I asked. He glanced toward the dark road ahead again before answering. "Backpacks, boots, pieces of gear left behind in strange places." A cold feeling crept up my spine. "Has anyone ever found the clearing?" I asked. The driver shook his head slowly. "Not that I know." We drove another mile before the first gas station lights appeared ahead along the highway. The glow felt almost surreal after hours spent in the darkness of the forest. The man pulled into the parking lot and stopped near the front of the building. "Let's get someone on the phone," he said. "If there are people out there doing what you described, the police are going to want to know." I nodded, though part of me already felt uneasy, because something about the way he had responded earlier didn't quite feel right. Not disbelief, not shock, just quiet familiarity. Like the story I told him wasn't entirely new. Inside the gas station, everything felt strangely normal. Bright fluorescent lights hummed softly above the aisles, and the quiet buzz of a refrigerator near the counter filled the space with a steady mechanical noise. After the darkness of the forest, the ordinary sounds and smells felt almost unreal. The driver walked straight toward the counter while I stayed near the entrance, still glancing through the windows at the road outside, as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. The clerk looked up from behind the register as we approached. "You guys all right?" he asked casually. The driver nodded toward me. "He got turned around in the woods," he said. "Says he ran into some people out there." The clerk frowned slightly, but didn't seem particularly surprised. "That happens sometimes," he replied. I stepped closer to the counter. "No, you don't understand," I said. "There's something going on out there. A clearing full of people's belongings. Bones. Symbols carved into the trees." The clerk's expression changed slightly when I mentioned the bones. He reached for the phone sitting beside the register. "I'll call the sheriff's office," he said. While he dialed, I leaned against the counter, the adrenaline finally beginning to wear off. My hands were still shaking slightly, and every time the door opened from the wind outside, I found myself turning instinctively toward the sound. The call didn't last very long. After explaining the situation briefly, the clerk hung up and looked back at us. "They're sending a deputy out here," he said. "Should be about 20 minutes." The driver nodded and stepped away from the counter, heading toward the coffee machine along the wall. I remained where I was, staring down at the scuffed floor tiles while my thoughts slowly caught up with everything that had happened. Missing hikers, backpacks hanging from trees, a ritual clearing deep in the forest, and a group of people who had been completely prepared for someone to wander into their territory. The driver returned a minute later holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to me. "You did the right thing getting out of there," he said. I took the cup and nodded quietly. For a while, we stood there in silence while the minutes passed. Eventually, red and blue lights appeared outside the station windows as a sheriff's vehicle pulled into the parking lot. A deputy stepped out and walked toward the entrance. As he came inside, I immediately noticed something strange. He greeted the driver first, by name. "Evening, Carl," the deputy said. The driver gave a small nod. Then the deputy turned toward me. "So you're the one who got lost out on the trails?" I began explaining everything again, describing the clearing, the bones, the symbols carved into the trees. The deputy listened quietly the entire time. When I finished, he remained silent for a few seconds. Then he said something that made the back of my neck tighten. "We'll take a look in the morning," he said calmly. "After sunrise?" I frowned slightly. "Why not now?" The deputy glanced briefly toward the driver, then back at me. And for just a moment, I noticed something hanging from beneath the collar of his uniform. A small necklace, made from thin pieces of bone. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. The bone fragments hanging from the thin cord around the deputy's neck were mostly hidden beneath the collar of his uniform. But when he shifted slightly under the fluorescent lights, the pieces moved just enough for me to see them clearly. They looked exactly like the necklaces worn by the figures in the forest. The same pale color, the same rough, irregular shapes, tied together with dark thread. A cold wave moved slowly through my chest. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, even as the realization settled in. The deputy noticed me looking. Without saying anything, he casually adjusted his collar, tucking the necklace completely out of sight. Then he smiled. It was a small, polite expression, the kind people use in ordinary conversations. But after everything I had just experienced in the forest, it felt deeply unsettling. "Well," he said calmly, "it's been a long night for you." The driver, Carl, nodded from beside the coffee machine. "You probably just ran into some locals camping deeper in the woods," the deputy continued. "There are a few groups around here that like to stay off the main trails. Camping." The word sounded absurd after what I'd seen, but neither of them seemed particularly interested in hearing anything more. The deputy rested one hand casually on the counter. "Why don't we get you somewhere safe for the night?" he suggested. "You can give a full statement tomorrow morning when everyone's rested." His tone was friendly enough. Too friendly. And suddenly, every detail of the evening started fitting together in a way that made my stomach tighten. The missing hikers, the abandoned gear, the carefully marked trees, the traps in the forest, and the fact that the cult members had disappeared the moment headlights appeared on the road, almost like they knew exactly when it was safe to retreat, because someone had warned them. My eyes moved slowly between the two men standing in front of me, Carl and the deputy. Neither of them looked particularly nervous. If anything, they seemed strangely relaxed, like people who had handled this situation before. The deputy glanced toward the door. "Why don't we head outside?" he said. "I'll drive you down to the station." I hesitated. Not long enough to make it obvious, but long enough that the deputy noticed. His smile didn't disappear, but something about it changed slightly. And in that moment, I understood something terrifying. Getting out of the forest hadn't actually saved me. I had simply walked into the next part of the territory. The road, gas station, maybe even the entire town. All of it suddenly felt much smaller, much quieter, and possibly controlled by the same people who had been waiting in the woods. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The fluorescent lights above us buzzed softly while the quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the small gas station. Outside, the sheriff's vehicle idled in the parking lot, its red and blue lights still flashing against the windows. The deputy's expression remained calm, patient, like he was waiting for me to make a decision. I forced myself to nod slowly. "Yeah," I said. "That sounds good." The deputy gave a small, satisfied smile. "Good," he replied. He turned toward the door and pushed it open, the cool night air drifting inside as the three of us stepped back into the parking lot. The flashing patrol lights painted the pavement in slow pulses of red and blue. Beyond the gas station, the highway stretched into darkness in both directions. Carl walked slightly ahead of me as we approached the sheriff's vehicle. The deputy opened the back door. "Go ahead," he said. I stepped forward, and that was when something unexpected happened. A loud engine roared, suddenly from the highway. Another vehicle sped past the gas station entrance without slowing, its headlights briefly flooding the parking lot with bright white light. The sudden glare caused the deputy to glance toward the road for just a second. That was all the distraction I needed. Instead of climbing into the back seat, I turned sharply and sprinted toward the far edge of the parking lot. For half a second, neither of them reacted. Then the deputy shouted, "Hey!" I didn't look back. I ran past the row of parked trucks and vaulted over a low guardrail that separated the station from a narrow service road behind it. My legs burned from the exhaustion of the earlier chase, but adrenaline pushed me forward anyway. Behind me, I heard the deputy yelling again. A car door slammed, then footsteps. They were coming after me. The service road ran parallel to the highway for several hundred yards before curving toward a cluster of buildings further down the hill. As I ran, I pulled my phone from my pocket and desperately tried to power it on. The screen flickered weakly. 1% battery. No signal. But as I reached the bend in the road, a single bar suddenly appeared in the corner of the screen. Just enough. I dialed emergency services immediately. The phone rang once, twice. Behind me, the sound of an engine roared to life in the gas station parking lot. They had started the patrol vehicle. On the third ring, someone answered. 911, what's your emergency? I didn't slow down. There's a cult operating in the forest near the state park, I gasped. They're involved in multiple disappearances, and I think the local sheriff's office is helping them. The operator hesitated for a moment. Sir, where are you right now? I looked ahead. At the end of the service road, a large building stood with bright lights illuminating its entrance. A hospital. I'm running toward the county hospital off Route 18, I said quickly. Send someone from outside the county. Anyone but the local police. Behind me, the patrol car's headlights appeared around the bend, coming fast. But the hospital entrance was only 100 yards away. And for the first time since leaving the forest, there were people everywhere. The hospital entrance was brighter than anything I'd seen all night. White lights flooded the parking lot, illuminating rows of cars and the glass doors leading into the emergency wing. A few people stood near the entrance, smoking or talking quietly, their conversation stopping the moment they noticed someone sprinting toward them from the road. I didn't slow down. Behind me, the patrol car turned sharply onto the service road, its engine roaring louder as it accelerated in my direction. I reached the hospital doors and pushed through them, nearly colliding with a nurse who had been walking toward the exit. Please, I said breathlessly. call security." My voice must have sounded convincing enough because within seconds, 2 hospital staff members stepped between me and the entrance while another reached for a phone behind the desk. Through the glass doors, I could see the patrol car pulling into the parking lot. It slowed near the entrance, but it didn't come any closer. The deputy remained inside the vehicle for several seconds, staring toward the hospital doors. Then slowly, the car reversed. The headlights turned away from the entrance and disappeared back down the service road. For the first time since leaving the forest, the tension in my chest loosened slightly. Hospital security arrived moments later, followed by a different police unit nearly 15 minutes after that. Not local deputies, state police. I told them everything. The forest, the clearing, the bones, the symbols carved into the trees, the cult members chasing me through the woods, and the necklace I had seen around the deputy's neck. They listened carefully, taking notes the entire time. Eventually, one of them nodded. "We'll send a search team out there in the morning," he said. True to their word, several teams entered the forest at sunrise the next day. Helicopters flew over the area. Search crews walked the trails for hours, but by the end of the afternoon they returned with nothing. No clearing, no wooden structure, no piles of abandoned gear, not even the symbols carved into the trees. According to the report, the section of forest I described showed no signs that anything unusual had ever been there. No evidence of a camp, no bones, no markings, just miles of untouched woods. The state police eventually concluded that I'd probably become disoriented while hiking after dark and misinterpreted things I saw in the forest. The official report described the event as a nighttime navigation error combined with stress. Most people seemed satisfied with that explanation. But a few weeks later, after everything had settled down, I looked something up online. The name I had seen on the back of the broken phone near the first backpack. It didn't take long to find it. The person had been listed as a missing hiker almost a year earlier. The last place they were seen alive was the exact same trail where I'd started my hike. And the strangest part wasn't that they had disappeared. It was the photograph used in the missing person report. Because hanging around their neck in the picture was a thin cord necklace made from several small pieces of bone, exactly like the ones worn by the people in the forest, which meant one of two things was true. Either the person I thought had been a victim had actually been part of the cult, or the people who ran that forest had a very strange way of choosing their next members. For a long time, I tried to forget about what happened in those woods. The official explanation made it easier for everyone around me to move on. Friends joked about how I must have watched too many horror movies before going hiking, and the local news never mentioned the incident again after the state police closed their investigation. Eventually, life returned to normal, at least on the surface, but something about the entire experience never sat right with me. The clearing had felt real, the bones had been real, and the people chasing me through the forest had definitely been real. Months passed before I decided to look deeper into the disappearances around that park. Most of the missing hikers were never found. Some had vanished 10 years ago, others even earlier. But as I scrolled through the reports, a strange pattern began to appear. Several of the missing people had something in common. It wasn't their age, it wasn't their hometown, it was something else. In the photographs attached to their reports, a few of them were wearing necklaces, thin cords, small objects hanging from them. First, I thought it might just be coincidence. until I enlarged one of the images. The object wasn't jewelry. It was bone. The same kind I'd seen hanging from the necks of the people in the clearing. And that's when something else occurred to me. Something I hadn't considered before. If those hikers had already been wearing the necklaces, then they hadn't been victims. They had been members, which meant the clearing in the forest might not be where the cult chose its victims. It might be where they welcomed their new ones. The thought sat in the back of my mind for weeks after that, until one night I received a notification on my phone, an email from the state police department. At first, I assumed it was just a follow-up message about the investigation, but when I opened it, the subject line made my stomach drop. Missing person report. The name listed in the email was unfamiliar, but the attached photograph wasn't, because standing behind the missing hiker in the image was a trailhead sign, the exact same trail where I'd started my hike that afternoon. The report said the person had disappeared 2 days earlier. Search teams were already combing the forest, but something about the photograph caught my attention immediately. The hiker was smiling at the camera, and hanging loosely around his neck was a thin cord necklace made from several small pieces of bone, exactly like the ones worn by the people in the forest, which meant one of two things. Either the cult was still operating in those woods, or the people searching for them had been looking in the wrong place the entire time. Because if those necklaces meant what I think they do, then the next time someone disappears near that trail, they might not be the victim. They might already belong to them.